Hi, I'm Mason Marsh. I'm a photographer and educator at Rhodes Scholar, and I'm here to talk about the total solar eclipse that's going to cross North America on April 8th of this year. Solar eclipses are amazing photographic opportunities. So I had the chance to photograph the last eclipse in 2017, and I've got some tips and considerations for you as you plan and prepare for this amazing event. All right, April 8th is coming up pretty quick, and my first tip has to do with planning. Can you get yourself to the middle of the path of totality? Because that's the best place to view and photograph a total solar eclipse. Exactly what is the path of totality? It's the shadow of the moon as the moon blocks the sun. It's about 115 miles wide. We call it the umbra. And if you are in the middle of that pathway, you're going to experience about 4.5 minutes of totality, where the moon is obscuring the surface of the sun. 4.5 minutes, that's amazing. In 2017, we had about 2 minutes of totality. It went by so quick. I'm really excited for those of you who are going to be able to see it this year, because you get almost twice as much time to make amazing images. If you're not right in the middle, as you get to the edges of the umbra, or to the edges of this path of totality, you're going to get down towards about 3 minutes of totality, which is still a lot of time, but the closer you can be to the center, the better. Now, if you're outside of the path of totality, you're going to see a partial solar eclipse, which is very difficult to photograph and make interesting photos. You really want to be inside that path of totality. There are great maps out there that help guide you on where exactly this path is going to be and at what time the path will travel over certain locations. Again, this starts way down in Mexico and will travel up through the United States and exit in the Northeast up through Canada, across a great swath of North America. Those of us who aren't near the path of totality, we're going to see a percentage of partial eclipse. I'm out in Oregon, so I'm only going to see a little bit of the moon covering the sun. Not going to be much of an eclipse at all for me. So very excited for those of you who get to see this. Tip number 2 has to do with viewing the eclipse and photographing the eclipse. I have to be honest and tell you, viewing the total eclipse in 2017 was one of the most amazing things I have ever seen. It was not, however, one of the best photographic opportunities I've ever had. The cold truth is, eclipse photos are very hard to make. They're very hard to do well. So we're going to talk about some of the things that you can do to maximize your opportunities during the eclipse, but I want you to come into the eclipse with proper expectations. It is a far better experience than it is a photographic opportunity. That said, I want you to enjoy the experience. So here's some of the things you can do to make the best of the experience. Number 1, go with some people, go with friends, go with loved ones. It's a really amazing experience to share with other people. I had the opportunity to view the last eclipse in a park, and there were hundreds of people around. And during the eclipse, everyone got real quiet, and it was really surreal, and it was a really interesting shared experience, and we all had a wonderful time. So I encourage you to share the experience of the eclipse with other people. Getting caught up in the photography of it can be exciting and can be fun, and certainly the photographs are going to be worth the effort, but I don't want you to miss out on the magic of the event. Tip number 3 has to do with safety. You have to protect your eyes and your camera in the periods of partial eclipse. So leading up to totality and just after totality, the sun is only going to be partially obscured by the moon, and there's going to be a lot of sunlight heading into your eyes and into your camera. Now, we know not to look at the sun. Everybody knows that, but during an eclipse, it's really hard not to look up there to see what's going on. So I would invest in a pair of good eclipse glasses. Now, these aren't sunglasses. These are much, much darker. They contain a special solar film. And so you want to make sure if you go buy eclipse glasses that they are rated for real eclipse. They're going to have an ISO rating, and that's what you want to look for. Now, when it comes to cameras, if you're using a wide-angle lens, you're not going to hurt your camera taking pictures of the partial parts of the eclipse. It's the telephoto lenses, it's the longer lenses. When you're focusing the intensity of the sun onto your sensor, that's where you can destroy your camera's sensor. And so you're going to want to use an eclipse filter. This is one for my telephoto lens that I have. This is a 20 stop neutral density filter. So this is made for photographing the sun and for eclipses. You don't want to use a normal traditional neutral density filter. They're just not strong enough to block the power of the sun. So this is properly made for the Eclipse, and it is they're still readily available. So in 2017, these were really hard to find. This year, they're much easier to get. So get out there and find a proper heavy-duty neutral density filter that's designed for eclipses that will fit your telephoto lens. Make sure it's the right size to fit your lens. Next tip. Photographing the totality of the eclipse does not require a filter. So if you don't have a filter, you can't get a filter for your lens, don't worry. Just don't point your telephoto lens at the sun until totality begins. And so, like I mentioned, you're going to have 4.5 minutes if you're in the center of the path of totality. 4.5 minutes, that's amazing. You're going to have 4.5 minutes to make amazing photographs. You're going to take every filter off of your lens. Make sure that you are going to have maximize the light coming into your lens. And you're going to use manual exposure settings and manual focus to ensure that you get crisp and clear and properly exposed images. I'm going to talk a little bit now about the exposure settings that you should be looking for if you're using a telescopic lens or a telephoto lens and you're zoomed in on the sun and it's filling a lot of your frame. So let's talk about that. I'm going to look at some photos from 2017 and talk my way through that, okay? So I want to talk about some of the photos I made in 2017 and some of the mistakes I made and some of the things that I would do differently if I was photographing the eclipse in April. So first of all, during totality, again, I can't emphasize this enough, the photography changes dramatically from the partial eclipse to total eclipse. You're going from direct sunlight into your camera to no direct sunlight into your camera. And so exposures change dramatically. And it is possible to photograph a total eclipse in a semi-autonomous mode like aperture priority or shutter speed priority. But chances are really good that the dramatic difference between the dark and light parts of your image are going to confuse your camera's sensor and confuse your camera's metering algorithm. So I would urge you to try manual photography. One, it's hard for your camera to focus in the dark light of total solar eclipse. So switching to manual focus and carefully focusing on the sun is going to really help you there. And then your camera isn't hunting around trying to find focus. Number two, you're going to enter manual mode of your camera so that you have control over ISO, f-stops or your aperture and your shutter speed. And this is something I promote a lot in my Rhodes Scholar classes. I think manual photography is oftentimes the best way to go, but definitely in difficult lighting situations like a total solar eclipse. So here we have a photo that I made in 2017. I was fortunate enough to be directly in the center of the path of totality and had a couple minutes to make a whole mess of photos. And I was using a 400mm lens on a full frame camera. And so to give you an idea of how big the sun is, or how small the sun is really, this is 400mm and the sun is not huge in the frame, right? It's just right in the center. And of course, the magic of the solar eclipse is that the moon is completely obscuring the surface of the sun, allowing us to observe the amazing solar atmosphere. They call it the solar flares, the corona, all of this stuff that projects from the surface of the sun that we never get to see because it's just too bright. So with the moon in the way, we are going to be exposing for this solar atmosphere. And you have a choice when you're photographing this. You can expose for the corona, which is this flared, you see this in the photo, sort of the feathery rays that are projecting off from the sun. The corona is really cool. It's monochromatic. It's going to be white in color in your photographs, and it's going to fade from bright to darkness pretty rapidly, but it has a cool texture to it. So you want to make sure that you use the edge of the moon to ensure that you're sharply in focus, and then you're going to go ahead and use as low a ISO as possible And in this case, with this image, I was using ISO 200. And you're going to set an f-stop that's going to maximize the sharpness of your lens. And so a lot of times that's going to be like f5.6 to f8, somewhere in that range. And in this case, I used 5.6. Now, my histogram in my camera told me that if I used a shutter speed of a 1/500th of a second, I would get decent results. The truth was it was actually underexposed at 5/100ths of a second. Now I want to take a pause here and mention that my camera was mounted on a tripod. We're going to talk about gear in a little bit more in a second, but my camera was mounted on a tripod and I could take photos that were a little bit longer in exposure, but not too long, because the sun and moon are actually moving really rapidly across the sky, or actually the Earth's rotating, right? So the sun and moon appear to be passing through the sky pretty rapidly, and so exposure of a couple seconds would probably result in something that looked soft and out of focus because of motion blur. A good rule of thumb is you want to use a shutter speed that is equal to, the number is equal to the length of your lens, or the focal length of your lens. So in this case, I'm using a 400mm lens. The rule I should have followed would be 1/400th of a second would be safe. I could get a sharp image at 1/400th of a second without motion blur. In this case, I shot at 1/500th of a second, which gave me a little bit more of a margin for error there, but it underexposed the corona a little bit. And so this is, if you look at the sliders here in Lightroom, you can see I increased exposure quite a bit to see the corona. If I go back and reset the settings, you'll see here that the actual original exposure is quite a bit darker. So this is the original exposure, no processing. But something incredible is happening here. And this is what I was looking at when I took the photo. If I zoom in just a little bit, you can see on the upper right-hand corner here where my little cursor is, there's a solar flare that was coming out in that upper right quadrant of the moon's shadow there. And actually there's another one over on the right edge. These solar flares, again, not visible unless we're in a total eclipse. Incredible, just jets of fire coming out from the surface of the sun, and you can see they're red. They actually, this is true color. This is what the camera red is kind of a deep red color. So I exposed so that those did not blow out, those did not overexpose, and the corona is less pronounced. So if I grab the exposure slider and I bring it up, you'll notice that the corona becomes more pronounced, more bold, more vivid. But I lose those solar flares. I lose those colorful little features. They get overexposed and lost. They turn to white. So you need to expose your images during the total eclipse so that you're not blowing out any of those features. But the price you're going to pay is that the corona is not going to be as pronounced. So here's what I would do. Here's what I would suggest. I would suggest, since you're going to have 4.5 minutes, if you're in the middle of the path of totality, you're going to have 4.5 minutes. You should take photos with exposures that give you sharp images where you see these solar prominences, these flares, these little textured things right along the edge of the shadow of the moon. Then go ahead and start exposing a little bit brighter to get the corona in. You might have to zoom out a little bit. If you're zoomed way in, you have to zoom out. The corona projects pretty far from the sun, and you can get some pretty dramatic photos of the corona. So there's a couple of different approaches you can make, and I think they're both really cool. So you could probably pull off both during your 4.5 minutes of totality. Really, really incredible event. Now, this again was with a 400mm lens. If you have a 600mm lens or something like that, all you're going to get is closer to the sun, get more detail, and you won't have to crop. In these images at 400mm, I would probably crop quite a bit to get the sun larger in the frame. So 600mm I think is the sweet spot on a full frame camera. All right, that is what I have to say about manual exposure and manual focus. Let's talk about the photographic possibilities during the partial eclipse. There's a few moments, really magical moments, right before totality and right after totality, where the moon is almost completely obscuring the surface of the sun, and we get this incredibly brilliant burst of light around the edge of the moon. Now this photograph was taken right before totality, just as the moon was sliding over the full disk of the sun. And you can see here I have, it's gotten to the point where I could take my Eclipse filter off, that big strong filter off the camera, and there's not so much sun that's going to hurt my sensor. And I was able to take this photograph. Now this is at ISO 200. It's still with my 400mm lens, but I'm shooting at f/16 and 1/3200th of a second. So you got lots of light to work with here. But what we've got is this really cool sort of explosion of light and a little bit of fine detail around the rim of the moon. I also happen to have a really strong flare in my lens. That's an inevitability whenever you shine a bright light into a lens. But I really like this stage of the eclipse because we're not, we're almost to totality. And so we're sort of at this magical moment where the sun is being almost completely consumed by the moon. And eventually, a few moments from this shot, you're going to get to what's called the diamond ring. And that is where the moon is almost completely blocking the edge of the sun, and you get this type of an effect where just a sparkle of light is coming off. In fact, that one's not even in focus. Let's try the next one. There we go, a little bit better. So this is called the diamond ring. And now you can see a little bit more detail of the prominences from the sun. We're almost in totality, but we have this incredible burst of light coming around. These are the moments that you look for going into and out of totality. You want to make sure you're ready to capture those. So my tip to you would be, as you reach the end of the partial eclipse, take a moment to remove your filter and get ready to make exposures during that really fleeting moment where the moon is breaking the disk of the sun and creating those diamond effects. Now, I told you I was going to talk about the partial eclipse. Now, I have to tell you that photographing a partial eclipse with a filter is, it's pretty boring, to be honest. This is what you get. When you put a eclipse filter on your camera, it just ends up looking like a half moon, like a crescent moon almost, without any of the craters, without any of the cool details. You're looking at just a sliver of the sun. This part of the eclipse, it's actually much better to take landscape photos, to take photos of the scene, of a larger area where the sun is much smaller in the sky. Because at this point in the eclipse, it's getting pretty dark. And the light coming down from the sun, the little bit of sun that's showing, the light coming down has taken on a different quality. So here's a picture of my wife and kids during this period. And you'll notice that the sunlight has got a real warmth to it. It's almost a metallic color. It's very cool. And everything's getting darker. Colors are very rich, very bold, and shadows are very sharp. In fact, during the later stages and early stages of the partial eclipse, so right before totality, right after totality, this quality of this light is really magical. And so this is the time to take pictures of people around you, the setting. If you're set up in a place with a vista, this would be the time to take landscape photos with that partial eclipse up in the sky. It's really pretty amazing. Now, I wasn't in a location in 2017 where I had any kind of view of the countryside or mountains or anything cool like that. I was in a city park. So I ended up taking a lot of people photographs, but the partial eclipse through a telephoto lens, pretty underwhelming, to be honest, pretty underwhelming. So my advice would be, again, use the long telephoto lens for totality, and you don't need an eclipse filter for that. Use your wide angle lens and shoot the scene, shoot people around you, photograph the incredible light and shadows that are created during the partial eclipse. And so you're shifting gears pretty rapidly. And so you need to be ready for that. And it's really, it's a fun exercise. It's a good photographic challenge. All right, next I want to talk about the gear. I've mentioned before, and I'll say it again, I think having two cameras to cover the eclipse is a really great approach. One camera could be, the wide angle camera could be your phone, could be a smartphone. I would find whatever good camera you have that has a wider angle lens and have that on a strap ready to take those photos of the people around you and the landscape around you as the sun is being consumed by the moon during the partial eclipse phase of the event. Now, when it comes time to photograph close-ups of the sun, you're going to need a telephoto lens, and this is a 200 to 600 zoom lens on a full-frame mirrorless camera. And it's mounted on a really sturdy tripod. And I think the tripod really helps here because the sun is not very big in the sky, and it's very hard to acquire that sun, to find it when you're aiming a telephoto lens. And so one of the things that you'll actually want to practice before the eclipse is tracking the sun in the sky. It's amazing how fast it moves during an event like this. So at 600 millimeters, would put the eclipse filter on it during the partial eclipse parts of the event. Take it off for the totality portion. Have a place to put this filter. So I keep a case or something nearby so I don't have to spend any time fumbling around with gear. You just want to have a quick place to put this, and certainly you don't want to put an expensive filter on the ground. So find a good spot to put it, set it aside. Now you're going to go ahead and use your gear. So using a full frame camera with a 600 millimeter lens, that sun is going to be pretty big in the frame. Not filling it up completely, but giving me plenty of room to capture that corona and to get good detail on all of those prominences around the edges of the sun. So you'll notice that I've got it mounted on a really heavy duty tripod. We're not talking about long exposures here. Remember, I was talking about 1/500th of a second, 1/400th of a second, or even higher. You don't need the tripod for motion blur and for stability. What you need to do is just keep your camera in position so you can track the sun and focus on making good exposures. So I think a good, nice tall tripod's great. If you have a tilting screen on the back of your camera, you could have a lower tripod and then bring that screen out so you can see what you're doing. If you didn't have a tilting screen, you would get a chair or a stool and get yourself down lower so you can put your eye in the right position to assess your images, because you're doing manual exposure work. The camera is going to let you be in control. So you're going to scrutinize every photo you take on the screen. You're going to readjust your settings, and you're going to keep trying. Again, you've got over 4 minutes, so you're going to be able to make a lot of amazing photos. So strong tripod that'll get you up high enough or stable enough so that you can keep the camera generally pointed in the direction of the sun. An adjustable ball head or some sort of tripod head so you can readjust after each image to keep that sun centered in your frame. And then if you need a tilting screen, something like that, that's really helpful. Lastly, the last thing I would say is, as far as other settings, you're going to be manually setting your shutter speed, your aperture, and your ISO. You're going to be manually focusing. You want to make sure you also turn off any image stabilization. So if there's image stabilization on the lens or in the camera, you want to turn that off. You don't need it for this shot. You're taking pretty high-speed shots. You want to eliminate any chance that your camera might accidentally blur a photograph. Last thing I'll talk about before we get done talking about gear is, if you don't have a 600 millimeter lens, don't sweat it. You can make great eclipse photos with a 200 millimeter lens. If you have enough pixels, if you have enough resolution, you can always crop a little bit into that frame. Obviously, not everyone has a 600 millimeter lens, and finding a rental one at this point for the eclipse is probably going to be pretty difficult. But you know, if you have access to a 600 millimeter or 400 millimeter lens, that's going to give you a really great reach and really great view of the event. That's all I have to say about gear. To wrap this all up, I want to reaffirm that this is an amazing event to witness. Total solar eclipses are just surreal, and they're visually stunning. They don't always translate into amazing photographs, so please remember to stop and enjoy the moment. Do your best to make great photographs, but really my recollections of the 2017 eclipse, I love the photographs that I made, but I was really enraptured by the entire scene. The way everybody got quiet as the sun went into totality, how the shadows before and after totality were so interestingly shaped. They were crescent-shaped little shadows. It's just a really, really surreal scene. And I wouldn't want to trade anything for that. So make sure you take some time to enjoy the experience. enjoy the people around you, and have a great, great time. Good luck with your photographs, and I hope to see you in a future class. Thank you.